Welcome to Inside the Election, Narratives and Citizen Engagement 2020 and Beyond by Nancer, Ballard, and Savannah Jackson.
Hi, everyone. I'm Savannah Jackson, and it is my pleasure to introduce Nancer Ballard. Nancer is a practicing environmental lawyer and resident scholar at the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis University. In addition to writing several books and numerous stories and articles, Nancer is the creator of the Heroine's Journey Project, a website blog platform dedicated to analyzing literature, film, and life experiences that deviate from the conventional story arc that is often referred to as the hero's journey. In the fall of 2020, Nancer worked on the Florida Democratic Volunteer Lawyers Voter Protection Team. At the same time, she was coordinating a group of colleagues who participated in volunteer election-related activities in 8 swing states. In 2020 and 2021, Nancer and I have been studying and writing about the role of narratives in social change.
And now, I'd like to introduce my student scholar partner, Savannah Jackson. Savannah is a third-year undergraduate student at Brandeis University, studying sociology, international and global studies, and Hispanic studies. Savannah and I have been working on the website blog platform that she just mentioned, the Heroine's Journey and Beyond project, since September 2018. We have examined films, literature, and social reform movements through the hero's journey narrative arc frame, which generally involves an individualist hero overcoming 2 or 3 obstacles and achieving glory and permanent success. We've also studied a host of works and alternative narrative arcs that demonstrate the inadequacy of the hero's journey for creating and sustaining a diverse, inclusive, post-mythic worldview. Okay, as we now all know, the title of this presentation is Inside the Election, Narratives and Citizen Engagement 2020 and Beyond. Along with a number of election efforts, we'll be discussing a theme that permeated each of those efforts. We'll start with the introduction, in which we'll talk about radical acts.
Next, we'll talk about the vote by mail initiatives and show how success always breeds challenges.
Then we'll look at poll watcher recruitment and the power of many relationships.
From there, we'll move on to messaging and talk about why we can't let cultural narratives tell our story. We'll also take a look at ballot cure process and see why every moment matters.
And then through the voter protection hotline, we'll show why these efforts are bigger than voting.
And finally, we'll close with some conclusions and suggestions for the future about elections and life.
In August of 2020, I was invited to join the Florida Volunteer Lawyers Voter Protection Team. The team included some Florida Democratic lawyers and more than 60 lawyers from California and East Coast states. We met via Zoom once a week. The meetings were organized by Florida co-counsel for the Biden campaign and 4 team leaders with strong Florida ties who had worked on previous elections. The week I joined, we received a timeline of tasks to be completed over the 10 weeks until Election Day. 2 weeks later, when the Brandeis University semester began, I also offered to coordinate a group of 40 or so professional colleagues and friends composed of Brandeis University scholars, lawyers from the Massachusetts Women's Bar Association, and writer and artist colleagues. They all wanted to be active in the election and were looking for direction and wanted to know that their efforts would make some difference. In coordinating our Active Citizens Engagement Group, or ACE for short, I wanted to implement the principles that Savannah and I were discussing in our Heroine's Journey work. There had to be some measure of organization, but I also wanted the group activities to be flexible, to not have a top-down hierarchy, or to have to give directives. So my guiding principles were common purpose, which in this case was to defeat Donald Trump by working for a free and fair election, flexible, non-competitive group relationships, regularly conveying my knowledge and support to the group, but being transparent about the limitations of my knowledge, sharing other members' expertise and positive experiences, and offering genuine appreciation and evidence that individual members and the group as a whole were making a difference. Later, I realized that two other things were also important. Celebration of positive outcomes in a post-election debriefing, and providing an opportunity to brainstorm about potential future collaborations. Meanwhile, Savannah and I had received funding to examine the role of narrative journey arcs in social change movements.
One of the things that we read was Francesca Paletta's Contending Stories, Narratives in Social Movements. In the article, Paletta observes that Western movement stories tend to attribute insurgency to individual, independent actors, rather than to the relationships that motivate and sustain participation. Nancer and I have found that no one can create sustainable change on their own. We started to create alternative social change narratives that are grounded in a broader, non-binary, relationship-focused worldview. Narratives help people understand how their realities and experiences fit into a broader social context. If we can shift away from the hero's journey narratives that place success in the hands of only a few extraordinary individuals, we can create new narratives that help us to realize that we are not alone and that our challenges are not just our own personal problems. Realizing this might help us to seek out others, not only because we see that others face similar problems, but because when we recognize that our personal problems are part of larger social issues, we better understand how the solutions will require us to work together.
I learned many things while working for the Florida Voter Protection Team. One of the most obvious, but also one of the most profound things I realized is that the act of voting is one of the truly egalitarian experiences in the United States, available to all citizens over the age of 18. And because equality is so rare, voting is profoundly radical. The vote of the low-wage earner working 3 jobs to pay rent counts just as much as the vote of the CEO of a bank. Think about that for a second. How many times in our life are things really equal? At first, I was embarrassed because I thought I was so privileged that I had taken voting for granted since I was 18. But then I realized it was actually the opposite. As a woman who had once been very poor, and as a lesbian, and as someone who believes in equality and empathy, I, like so many others, had assumed that things weren't ever really equal. But here it was. When you vote, each person matters as much as anyone else. But as soon as I realized how radical voting is, I then thought, oh, that's why making voting equally accessible to all meets such strong resistance. And it's not going to go away on its own. On the voter protection team, our plan to protect everyone's vote included having a lead lawyer coordinate with local officials and local Democratic leaders in each of Florida's 67 counties. This was a great plan on paper, but many of us had little firsthand knowledge of Florida and couldn't travel or meet with county election officials in person because of the pandemic. And more than a dozen counties had virtually no Democratic Party presence. When I looked at our timeline, I saw that the county lawyer leads, many of whom hadn't yet been assigned, were supposed to be meeting with supervisors of elections and recruiting canvass monitors. Canvass monitors are the representatives of each party who watch or monitor the county officials who review vote by mail ballots. So here's a picture of the canvass monitor you can see in the back, looking at all those who are pulling out the vote by mail ballots. And in this next slide on the right, you can see a couple of canvass monitors looking at the government official who's reviewing a signature on the computer. We anticipated a huge number of vote by mail ballots due to the pandemic, and Florida starts reviewing vote by mail ballots in mid-October. So it was important to find and train canvass monitors right away. But being a canvass monitor is a big commitment. And many of the out-of-state attorneys who had been assigned as leads didn't know people in Florida and had a hard time recruiting canvass monitors. Our weekly Zoom meetings gave me a high-level view of behind-the-scenes election operations, which sometimes felt exhilarating and sometimes felt like watching the Titanic moving slowly toward the iceberg from 30 feet in the air. while also being a crew member.
That feeling that Nancer is describing really encapsulates the fact that it's a lot easier to make sense of what is happening and how current events contribute to the long-term whole when you're not in the middle of everything. However, we are constantly telling ourselves stories and telling others stories. We tell stories to try to make sense of what is happening, to share what is happening, and to encourage everyone to keep moving forward. When we don't know what will happen next, we often try to fit what we do know into a familiar narrative arc. I have a feeling this is part of what draws us to the hero's journey arc stories that we grew up with. In the midst of uncertainty, we want to turn individuals into heroes that we can believe in, and we imagine our future successes as permanent.
I told our team leaders that I would go to Florida in October, but none of them knew where I would be most needed or most useful. So meanwhile, I learned to identify activities on the timeline that I might be able to contribute to and asked for confirmation rather than waiting for direction. Our next most pressing need was to protect in-person voting by recruiting poll watchers and poll observers. But before we jump into poll watcher recruitment, let's look at the vote by mail campaign, which had already been going on for months. One of the things I learned from working on the 2020 election is that if you don't end a story with the first bloom of success, success always leads to problems. And the vote by mail ballot request project was wildly successful. As many of you know, because you likely participated in it, during the spring and summer of 2020, millions of people, including many of my Brandeis colleagues and friends and neighbors, wrote postcards and letters to swing state voters, encouraging them to vote by mail. In our area, most of the postcard packets were distributed by sub-hubs of volunteers who are associated with Swing Left of Greater Boston or Vote Forward. Many other groups, such as the ACLU, Indivisible, Vote America, and the NAACP were also involved. These groups did a lot of upfront work for us. We postcard writers received lists of addresses, stamps, postcards, and a short suggested script, which was sometimes in Spanish or another language, as well as in English. We then tried to make it easy for voters. In many cases, all the voters had to do was tear off the top of a folded up postcard and drop the bottom half in the mail in order to request a vote by mail ballot. My colleagues and I sent hundreds of postcards. In 2016, Trump had beat Hillary Clinton in Florida by only 112,000 votes. In September, our Swing Left coordinator told us that Swing Left had sent more than 900,000 postcards to Florida. Not every postcard would result in a voter requesting a vote by mail ballot, of course, but we were only one group among many who were sending them. However, when I began working for the voter protection team, I realized that a huge increase in vote by mail ballots would also mean a huge increase in the number of ballots with technical defects. In Massachusetts, I put my vote by mail ballot in the goldenrod envelope that came with it. I signed the envelope and put the goldenrod envelope in the white outer envelope and dropped it in the mailbox. The town official then checked to see whether I'd already voted. Since I hadn't, my ballot was counted. However, in Florida and many other states, the process is much more complicated.
In Florida, when you vote by mail, a county official compares the signature on the interior ballot envelope with the signature on your voter registration card. If the official believes that there is a mismatch between these two signatures, your ballot can be rejected. Signature mismatch can sound like a very serious thing. It might sound as if someone is fraudulently voting in someone else's name, but more than 99% of the time, this is not what is happening.
When I worked for the voter protection team, I spoke with a young man I'll call Thomas. Thomas's ballot was rejected because when he signed his voter registration card, he used his middle initial. But when he signed his mail-in ballot, and of course he wasn't looking at his registration card then, he didn't use a middle initial. Older people's ballots are often rejected because their handwriting has changed since they first registered to vote, or they have Parkinson's or arthritis. Many people's handwriting changes over time because they no longer write much in cursive. or they've gotten married and now use their married name, or they've gotten divorced and have gone back to their original name, or they sign their ballot envelope Ted instead of Theodore. Officials who are checking signatures have to use their judgment on whether a signature is close enough, which of course can lead to uneven application. The officials aren't supposed to look at the ballot when they examine signatures, but they can often tell from the address or people's names how they are likely to be voting. In this case, you can see here the government official is on the computer looking at the registration card, and the two people looking on are the canvas monitors who are comparing the signature on the registration card with the signature on the envelope. Recruiting Democratic canvas monitors is really important because the monitors witness how the signature mismatch rejection process is being applied. And they also make sure that the other party's monitor isn't just challenging ballots willy-nilly.
When a ballot is rejected for a technical defect, the supervisor is supposed to notify the voter and give them the chance to cure or remediate their ballot. Voters can do this by filling out and signing an affidavit form that confirms that they voted by mail.
The signature on the affidavit form then overrides the signature on the registration card, but only for that one election. The voter must also make a copy of their picture ID and return the affidavit and the copy of their ID to the supervisor of elections. Curing ballot defects will come up again later, but for now, let's go back to the wildly successful Vote by Mail initiative. As you can now see, the success of Democrats' Vote by Mail postcard campaign meant that thousands, even tens of thousands of ballots might not be counted if voters couldn't be contacted and persuaded to cure technical defects. This made me very nervous. When I asked our team leaders and the ballot cure trainers about the number of vote by mail ballots requested compared to the number of ballots that had been sent back and counted, I was told not to worry about that yet, because we also needed to protect in-person voting, and the poll watcher list submission deadline was only a few weeks away.
There are three categories of officials who are allowed at polling places. First, poll workers are hired by the county. They confirm registration materials and hand voters their ballot. In the picture on this slide, you can see that the poll workers are the ones sitting down, actually interacting with the voters. Second, poll watchers, and that's going to be one from each party, are allowed to watch and make sure that poll workers and voters are abiding by state laws. In this picture, the poll watchers are the two women standing at the back with their arms crossed in front of them. Poll watchers can't speak or interfere with poll workers or voters. If they want to communicate with someone, they can either ask to speak to the deputy on the floor or go outside and call the hotline, or they can talk to a poll observer. The third category is poll observers, and in this picture, that's going to be the woman talking to the camera. Poll observers are representatives of the parties who are stationed outside of the polling place. They consult with poll watchers and relay information to lawyers or hotlines. They also watch for intimidation, long lines, people who need water, and medical emergencies.
In our voter protection Zoom meetings, we were told that polling places needed 2 shifts of poll watchers and 2 shifts of poll observers for every day of early voting and on election day. The team leaders said that poll watchers were to be recruited for priority polling places. But when I asked a recruitment trainer if we had a list of priority polling places, she said we were recruiting poll watchers for all polling places. This sounded like a great idea. And then I started doing the math. As you can see here, there are 67 Florida counties, so more than 60 counties. And then if you multiply that times 6 to 12 polling places in each county during early voting, you get 600. And then if you multiply that number times the 10 days of early voting, then you get 6,000. And then you have to add an additional 1,500 polling places on election day, because on election day, there are more polling places per county than there are in early voting. So that brings us to 7,500. And there are 2 shifts of poll watcher shifts per day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. So that's 15,000, and 2 shifts of poll observers per day is another 15,000. So that comes to more than 30,000 if we wanted to fully staffed every early voting and election day polling place in Florida.
That sounds just really daunting to me. And I know that you've also talked about how the poll watcher recruitment process itself represented many challenges.
Right. The team leaders and the county leads were still looking for canvas monitors for the vote by mail review. So the bulk of the poll watcher recruitment ended up falling to the phone banks. And there's a significant learning curve for volunteer recruiters who have not done phone banking before. You have to understand the poll watcher and poll observing tasks. You have to know something about the rules for each position and also what COVID-19 safety measures a potential poll watcher could expect. Then the volunteer had to learn to use the recruiting script and access the phone bank of names that you were going to call, and you needed to get a phone login ID. And you had to learn how to use the script and the call list of names while also filling out an online response form on your computer or your tablet, while simultaneously calling potential phone watchers on your phone. And you also have to go back and forth between the Zoom room where you are logged in and your call list. It took most of us 2 or 3 shifts to become comfortable with the technology and the script so that we could operate relatively independently. The second problem was that only about 1 in 10 people answered their phones, and poll watcher recruiters were instructed not to leave messages. At first, this seemed good because we weren't quite sure what we were doing. But as soon as you were confident enough to do some serious recruiting, you realized that the low pickup rate meant that you were only going to speak to about 3 or 4 callers per 3-hour shift. And if you were lucky, sign up a couple of volunteers. Many phone bankers, including several in our active citizens engagement group, invested hours in the recruitment protocols and then decided that they wanted to do something else that felt more productive. By the 3rd week in September, the number of recruitment phone bankers had dwindled to 2 or 3 per session.
One of the things that I keep reminding myself of is that we can't ever take change for granted. That means that nothing will get done unless a lot of people not only say they're willing to do the unceremonious work, but also actually do the work. We can't just expect that other people will do something to solve the problem, or that the problem will magically resolve itself. Not taking change for granted also means recognizing that when we do achieve something, we can't assume that our success will last forever.
When it looked like we were going to be about 25,000 short of our 30,000 poll watcher recruitment goal, I persuaded the regional phone bankers in the Biden campaign to allow the more experienced phone bankers to leave messages and text people that we had not been able to reach. My response rate improved once I started texting, but as with other tasks, success brings new challenges. Leaving messages meant that potential volunteers often called me after my shift had ended, and I couldn't update the response form once I was off shift. One of the phone bank leaders said that I could email her the necessary information, and she or another phone campaign volunteer would enter it into their database. But of course, that meant that they had more work. A week later, the campaign introduced a voicemail script so that everyone could leave messages and voters could sign up online. That was great, but we still had the problem of only a few phone bankers per shift. So I asked Melissa, the phone bank leader, whether someone in the Biden campaign could contact Vote Forward or Swing Left and see if they had any volunteers who could help us. 2 days later, I logged into the Zoom room and I saw more than 100 volunteers from all over the country who had come to help. It felt like an absolute miracle. I will forever be in awe of Swing Left's ability to redirect such a workforce so quickly.
However, the story doesn't end there.
No. Despite Swing Left's phalanx of volunteers, we still needed to fill thousands of shifts. I wrote my voter protection team leaders and I asked for advice. Within 2 days, Hal Qualwesser, one of the team leaders who knew I was an environmental lawyer, sent me what he called an affinity group, a list of Florida Sierra Club chapters with some email addresses. And he asked me to find out if any of their members might volunteer as poll watchers. Using Hal's list as a starting point, I identified 16 Sierra Club chapters in Florida. I then created a template letter that included my affinity or common ground, that I'm an environmental lawyer, and why I was writing them, that the upcoming election would dramatically impact our country's response to climate change, and a request that the chapter notify its members regarding our urgent need for poll watchers in their counties. I described what poll watchers do and how they protect fair elections, and I included the sign-up link and my cell phone number. Creating the template letter, researching each chapter, gathering additional email addresses, customizing emails for each chapter, and responding to questions from the recipients took about 40 hours over only a few days. It would have been easier had there been more time, but the response from the Sierra Club chapters was really strong, especially since I was asking that my letter be circulated immediately because early voting poll watcher submission deadlines were less than a week away. And it was a great pleasure to talk to everyone who responded. After I finished the Sierra Club letters, Melissa reported a significant uptick in poll watcher signups. I asked her and Stephen Davis, the other recruitment coordinator, whether they wanted me to write similar letters to Unitarian Universalist churches. They said yes and told me which counties to focus on. I then created a new template highlighting my connection to Unitarian Universalism and stressing issues such as Black Lives Matter, immigration, and again, climate change. I included a quote by Alice Walker that was featured in the Wayside pulpit in my home church that week. After the early voting poll watcher submission deadline passed, Melissa asked me to write to the other Unitarian Universalist churches in Florida seeking poll watchers for Election Day. So I wrote to the remaining 45 churches and fellowships. A few days later, Melissa told one of our citizen engagement group members that she believed that the affinity group email letter writing project had produced up to 500 new poll watcher recruits based on the per day increase in volunteer signups. Since the average poll watcher works 3 or 4 shifts, those volunteers could have been staffing more than 1,500 shifts.
The whole poll watcher recruitment project really demonstrates the exponential power of building and strengthening relationships. Vertical and horizontal bidirectional connectivity, both within and across organizations, is crucial to building and sustaining social change movements.
Here you can see from the general outlook of this slide, even if you can't read it on your device, how much interaction was involved in the poll watcher recruitment campaign. The light blue is the Biden campaign. The tan color is me. The light green is our voter protection team. The orange is the active citizens engagement group. And then the bright green is the Sierra Club chapter, and the purple is Unitarian Universalist leaders. And of course, there's actually many more that would have been involved. Because the Biden campaign was talking to other people in the Biden campaign, and the Sierra Club leaders and the Unitarian Universalist leaders were talking to their members. During the fall, I often felt like people might be irritated that I spoke out so often about problems. I worried they think I was going outside my wheelhouse. But now I realize that people at the top and on the ground in organizations all have to be brave enough to speak out and to have enough humility to respond to the feedback they get. Those on the top have to appreciate those on the ground, and those on the ground have to appreciate all that those above them are doing. And that's what happened in this case, and that's why we ended up with a shockingly good result. And from here, we'll turn to messaging.
People sometimes think of messaging as social media or TV ads, but anything that disseminates information can be considered messaging. Messaging strategies can be designed to increase the reach of the information, so through telephone, mail, email, mass media, parodies, cartoons, or interpersonal contact. Messaging is also usually intended to increase people's motivation to use and apply the information. Otherwise, what's the point in communicating it? A good example of this is the Obama's messaging on Plan Your Vote. And third, messaging strategies are often intended to increase people's ability to use the information they're provided. This includes things such as flyers that showed where drop boxes were located or that listed the voter protection hotline numbers.
Research in many different fields shows that multiple forms of messaging are more powerful than a single approach. But of course, that can lead to oversaturation. So there are also a number of techniques that can be used to communicate messages more effectively. You can tailor your message, that is, customize your message for your specific audience, as I did with the Sierra Club and the Unitarian Universalist letters. I think of this as creating relationship if done in a genuine manner. You can also target your message. In other words, send your message to those you particularly want to reach. For example, the postcard campaigns often focused on voter groups that were thought to be less likely to vote than others. You can also use narrative techniques and make your message sound like a story or a textbook or a warning cry or reassurance. And you can frame your message. That is, present the information in a particular way so that it will be viewed through a certain lens or angle.
Messaging is a key part of how we share narratives. And this matters because how we then respond to narratives impacts the messages that we go on to share and the actions that we go on to take. We might intuitively understand how we internalize narratives and allow them to influence our actions, hopes, and beliefs. It is often much harder, however, to recognize how this process works in reverse. But when we internalize a narrative, it shapes the actions we take in response, and these actions shape how we continue to formulate and share the narrative, or to create new narratives. In this way, narratives and messaging are both crucial parts of the process of social change.
Once I began accessing a lot of Florida election-related websites, I started to get GOP PAC messaging along with the daily emails I was already receiving from Democratic organizations. Often the conservative messaging made me feel like I was being punched in the gut. Not because their information was new or accurate, but because it felt powerful. When I expressed my concerns to friends and my citizen group, they too said they were frustrated with Democratic messaging. When I brought it up at one of our Zoom meetings, I was told that the Republicans always have punchier messaging because Democrats try to explain their policies and are therefore too wordy. Savannah and I were already examining how narrative arcs are used in social movements, so I decided to figure out why the Trump GOP email messaging felt more potent than Democratic messaging. I soon realized that Trump and Republican PACs were playing on people's deepest emotional needs. Trump sound bites, rally cries, tweets, and political messaging almost always relied on some version of, I, Trump, am a hero and will keep you safe. Those who do not support me, Democrats, liberals, protesters, journalists, etc., hate you and want to harm you. We are patriots, and the Democrats are socialists, leftist radicals, anarchists, and bad. And we are in a war against them that must be won to save America.
Trump's messaging also included the basic elements of a sort of twisted hero's journey story. That is, a conflict or a threat with high stakes and two characters or opposing sides, the offer of a supposed solution, such as vote for me to prevent Biden from destroying America, or disregard science and believe what I say, or fight against the rigged election. They also often included an invitation to join in the fight to secure victory.
People rely on mental, oral, and written story-like narratives in their everyday lives because we find them useful in organizing information, determining cause and effect, and controlling anxiety. But with conscious attention to people's basic emotional needs and the structure of the messaging, I thought Democrats could go a long way towards disarming Trump messaging and strengthening the impact of their messages. Using my own background in creative writing and the work Savannah and I had been reading and discussing by Francesca Paletta, Elizabeth Armstrong, Marshall Gantz, and others, I wrote up a summary of my observations with how-to instructions for turning Republican rhetoric into an infinite array of Democratic support messages. The gist of it was, start with the Trump claim. In this case, Trump claims he is trying to get rid of the Affordable Care Act because he's got something better. Don't argue, just state a true contradicting fact. Why haven't we seen something better? Now add the statement that speaks to the psychological wish in the Trump claim, in other words, better health care. 20 million more people got coverage when Joe Biden was vice president, and insurers cannot exclude pre-existing conditions. And then close with what you want voters to do. Protect healthcare for you and your family, which means vote for Joe Biden. I also began experimenting with rhythm and using a combination of repetition and variation to support memorability. And I wrote messages that followed a similar pattern, but didn't use the word Trump or Republicans. Then I sent my analysis memo and a few examples to some of my contacts in the Biden campaign and to Ruth Nemzoff, who is participating in our Citizens Engagement Group. Ruth is also a scholar at the Women's Studies Research Center. She's a former New Hampshire legislator, and she's a powerhouse activist in her own right. She sent the memo to some of her contacts. I then created a bit.ly link so I could tweet it privately and sent it to a national writers coalition called Writers for Democratic Action, and another group called Moms Rising. I tweeted examples with the preface, 100 million reasons to vote for Biden and Harris during our presidential campaigns. I have no idea what, if any, role I played, but I started to see a slow shift in Democratic campaign messaging about 3 weeks later. And not knowing your impact is true of so many things, but it doesn't mean that you don't have any.
Sustainable social change occurs through many actions and interactions that might not always be obviously related to the change that we want. Hero's journey-esque narratives usually focus on heroic individuals and big events, but we can encourage the participation of more ordinary or everyday people if we use narratives that emphasize the importance of the hundreds of actions that take place off the big screen that nonetheless contribute to change. And if we can encourage more people to act, we can widen our view of what is possible.
Of course, the messaging story didn't end with the election. Here's an example of that I got about a week and a half ago. It's an exclusive offer for a commemorative coin of Trump that says, "Still my president." The offer is really the sleeve for the message that I've highlighted in pink there. That Democrats are dirty and don't want to hear the truth about the election, and that Trump, not Biden, is the only legitimate president. The offer of the coin is a pretext because Trump isn't president, so he can't make coins with any value. So instead, they are going to send you an authentic JFK $50, either instead or also, but it's not clear which. And they will include a certificate of authenticity, although I'm not sure whether that's for the JFK dollar or $50 or for the president, the Trump coin. This is a stunning metaphor, but to paraphrase Jamie Raskin, surely the country is worth more than a certificate of authenticity for a valueless coin. I suspect that many of these messages are generated by a bot in some foreign country that is creating clickbait from algorithms. But the important thing to realize is that we have entered a world in which the facts, people, and policies aren't what's generating the narrative. Content is being reverse engineered. The narrative is primary, and the so-called facts are then created from nouns and verbs and adjectives that appear in the news in order to give the story elements that are hung on the narrative some patina of realism. It may seem absurd, but it's important that we take it seriously. We must keep working to show the ways in which this kind of messaging is not coherent and not truthful, if we are to persuade people to align themselves with complicated facts and stories rather than oversimplified narratives. We must also bear in mind that people are not either intellectual processing machines or stupid. Nearly everyone has deep physical and psychological needs for safety, relationship, and belonging, and a need to formulate some kind of coherence to explain their feelings and guide their actions.
As we previously mentioned, ballot cure or ballot remediation is the process of helping voters whose vote-by-mail ballots are rejected because of a technicality cure the deficiency. Ballot cure also includes helping voters who cast provisional ballots in person or by mail helping them to take the additional steps that are required to make their votes count. The most common reasons for a voter to have cast a provisional ballot is that they forgot their photo ID when they went to their polling place in a state that requires it, or because they moved and failed to file a change of address. Their new polling place had no record of them being a resident in that precinct.
County officials in Florida are required by law to notify people if their vote by mail ballots have been rejected. However, there are many reasons that this is not sufficient, such as the mail isn't delivered promptly or isn't sent to the voter's current address. The voter believes their job is done once their ballot is mailed and doesn't open the notification or check the status of their ballot online. Or the voter doesn't realize that they've cast a provisional ballot and that additional steps will be needed for it to be counted. Or the voter believes the notification was a false intimidation tactic. Or the voter is afraid that the rejection of their ballot means they've done something wrong, or are too discouraged to try and fix the problem. Since many more Democrats than Republicans vote by mail, a higher percentage of Democratic votes are lost if the vast majority of rejected ballots are not cured. Ballot curing by phone bank can be a scattershot affair because less than 10% of voters answer their phones, and they are understandably suspicious of strangers telling them that their ballots have been rejected. Our ballot cure rate improved when phone bankers were told to text and leave voice messages telling voters that their ballots needed curing and giving them the hotline number to call for help. Here's an example of a cure ballot call that I got while working on the voter protection hotline. Good afternoon, Voter Protection Hotline. Can I help you?
Yes, hi, my name is Sylvia. I'm living in an assisted living facility in the Villages, and I'm calling for my friend Lillian, who is also living here. We both voted by mail, but my friend's ballot was rejected. And we aren't allowed to leave our facility because of the pandemic, and no one else is allowed in except people who work here. What can we do?
I can help you. How do you know Lillian's ballot was rejected?
She told me that it was.
Did she get a notice in the mail?
I don't know.
Okay, let's go on to the Supervisor of Elections site and we can check both of your ballots and figure out what the problem is. Do you have a smartphone?
No.
Okay, is it okay if I check for you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. It's showing that your ballot has been accepted and that Lillian's has been rejected because of a signature mismatch. But don't worry, we can fix that. Lillian will need to file an affidavit saying that, that she voted by mail with her signature and provide a copy of an ID. Do you or Lillian have a printer to print out the affidavit?
No, we don't.
Does anyone else at your facility have one?
Yes, but they're all Republicans as far as I can tell.
Okay. Well, it's great that the two of you are pursuing this. Is there anyone you can trust who could print out an affidavit if I read you the link?
I think the building manager might do it.
Okay, I'll read you the link. Have him print out the affidavit and then Lillian or the two of you can fill it out. Does Lillian have a picture ID with her address on it?
Yes, she does.
Can you make a copy of it?
I think the building manager can do that.
Great. Once that's done, we'll need to get it to the Supervisor of Elections, but I'm on the hotline again tomorrow, so we can do this one step at a time if you want to.
Thank you. That would be great.
Okay, great. You can call me tomorrow, or I have your number, so I could call you.
Okay, just don't call around dinner time. We can't talk to anyone when it's dinner.
Okay, I'll call around 2. The next afternoon, I called Sylvia. Were you able to get the affidavit?
No, the building printer is only for company business.
Oh, do you have any family members or friends who could bring you the affidavit?
No, not really.
Okay, sometimes we have volunteer runners who can deliver affidavits. Let me check. Looks like we don't have anyone in your area today. but I have an idea. So let me see what I can do and I'll get back to you.
You sure are going to a lot of trouble.
That's okay. I'm glad to do it. And I'm glad you're sticking with me.
Well, these days, I think that every vote counts.
That's what I think too. So hang in there. We'll make this work. My wife has a former colleague who lives in the Villages. We call her to find out if she can print out an affidavit and run it over to the assisted living facility. She agrees. I get approval from my hotline captain and then call Sylvia and tell her the plan. When my wife's friend arrives, she will knock on the door and deliver the affidavit in an envelope with Lillian's name on it to the doorman. Lillian will fill out the affidavit and then the custodian will make a copy of Lillian's photo ID and drop off the envelope with the affidavit and the copy of the photo ID in it in the drop box outside the supervisor of elections office after work.
Our custodian goes right by the drop box on his way home. He's very nice.
Okay, wonderful. The next day, I call again. Hi, Sylvia, it's Nancer again. Did you get the affidavit?
Yes, we did.
Did you get Lillian's ID copied?
Yes.
Was the custodian able to put it in the Dropbox?
No, and he doesn't work again until after the election.
Oh. Is there anyone else who could drop it off?
Well, someone from the League of Women's Voters was here a few weeks ago, but I'm not sure if they're coming back.
Do you know how to contact them and find out?
No, I don't.
All right. Let me talk to my shift captain. We've come so far, it would be a pity not to vote now.
Okay, thank you.
My wife's friend had already offered to deliver the ballot cure affidavit, but my hotline shift captain was able to arrange for a runner to pick up the affidavit and drop it in the Dropbox. A day later, I got a note in my hotline log. Lillian's vote had been accepted. Throughout the fall, I saw that personal connection builds trust in the information being provided, and that personal contact encourages voters to see themselves as part of a larger voting community. My experience in writing affinity letters, working on the hotline, doing ballot cure, and other things leads me to believe that multiple positive contacts with the same voter has a carryover effect on the voter's friends and families and promotes a long-term commitment to voting. The election work I enjoyed most included the hotline and ballot cure work, where I was able to solve a wide range of complicated issues that sometimes took several days. On election day, I was scheduled to work on the voter protection hotline from 6 in the morning to 11:30, and then again from 1 p.m. to 8:45 at night. Normally, when a caller phones the hotline, the call is routed to the next open line. If multiple hotline workers are free, the call is routed to the worker who has been free the longest. On election day, the most experienced workers were given what was called a prioritized line. Incoming calls were then routed to any prioritized line before they were sent to the other lines. In practice, this meant that the second I hung up with a caller, another call would be put through to my line. Hello, Voter Protection Hotline, can I help you?
Yes, I'm Maria, and I'm calling to report a problem I had at a polling place.
Okay, Maria, where are you calling from and how can I help?
Well, I parked at the Orlando Elementary School to vote, and I started to get my Rainbow Pride umbrella out of the car because it was raining, and I wasn't sure how long I would have to wait in line. And this 20-something man in a muscle shirt, kind of preppy looking, I don't like to stereotype, but that's what he looked like. Well, he came and stood right next to my car. I thought he'd finished voting and was about to get in his own car and drive off, but then he just stood there watching me in what felt like a very aggressive manner. And he continued just watching without getting into his car, so I decided not to take the umbrella. But when I was putting it back in my car, I realized that I also had a rainbow sign in the back seat, and that's what he was looking at. I shut my car door, and he crossed his arms and smirked at me and said, "Good luck," in a way that made me feel very uncomfortable. I locked my car and hurried over to the voting line, and when I came back after voting, the guy and his car were gone, but one of my tires had been slashed and was very flat.
Where's your car now?
Well, there's an auto repair place right across the street from the school, and I was able to drive the car that far.
Are you okay?
Yes, kind of shaken up. I called the police, but they said there wasn't anything they could do since the guy wasn't still there, and I didn't manage to get his license plate number.
Well, it's good that you called us.
I called because I wanted to know if there was something I could do. I'm Hispanic and gay, so I'm used to a lot of stuff, but I just didn't expect this.
I'm really sorry this happened to you. Could the tire repair place tell that the tire had been slashed?
Yes, I had just gotten new tires 2 months ago, and the car repair place had two mechanics who confirmed that the tire had been deliberately punctured.
Geez, I'm so sorry. It's horrible that you were just going to vote and this happened. Even if we can't find the guy, it's still horrible. Are you going to be able to get your car fixed?
Yes, I had to get a new tire.
Did you ask them to save the old tire?
No, it had been too badly punctured to be repaired.
Well, since it's only a couple of months old, it still might be under warranty. You might be able to get some money back if you can find out the name of the manufacturer of the punctured tire. Do you know where you got the tire put on?
Yes, it's a garage just around the corner from where I live.
Okay. Call the repair place near the school and tell them to save the tire for a while. But how are you feeling now? Is there anyone else you can talk to about this?
I'm okay. I keep telling myself it's just a car.
Well, it's good that you're not physically hurt, but it's still a violation, like having your apartment broken into. And so your body just reacts. You know, I don't live in Orlando, but I can probably find the name of someone you could talk to.
It's okay. I'm actually over at a friend's house right now. I wasn't feeling too well, but I think I'm doing okay now. I just wanted to call to see if there was anything else I could do.
You did everything right. I'll call this in so that if the guy shows up again or somewhere else, the poll observers will be on the lookout. But if you start feeling scared or sick later, feel free to call me back. My name is Nancer, and I'm on until 9 tonight. You might not get me when the line rings through, but you can ask for me.
Thank you. I'm fine, but I am glad that I called. I wasn't sure what you could do, but I feel better now. I'll call the tire repair place and tell them to keep the tire in case you need it as evidence.
Okay, you don't need to do that today, but it is worth seeing if you could get some money back.
Okay, I did file a police report.
Great, thanks. And thanks for going to all this trouble. And thanks for voting. As soon as I set my phone down, it immediately started ringing again. Voter Protection Hotline, can I help you?
Hi, I'm Alex, and I sent in a vote by mail ballot, but it wasn't showing up as being received, so I went to my polling place, but they told me I couldn't vote.
You should have been able to vote provisionally. What county are you in?
I'm in Lee County.
Okay. Are you willing to go back again? I know this is a pain and that now you've tried to vote twice, but as I'm sure you know, every vote really counts.
Well, sure, but how do I know it won't just happen again?
Let me check with my shift captain and find out whether we can call over in advance. Can you hang on the line for a minute? If we get cut off, I can call you right back. By 6:30 that evening, I was involuntarily shaking from so many hours of adrenaline-spurred focus and completely spent. But Election Day gave me a tremendous opportunity to talk to lots of people and solve lots of different kinds of problems. Stories of individual challenges and perseverance fortify all of us, regardless of whether we are the helper or the person being helped or co-helper. It gave me courage to hear from the young Hispanic lesbian who called the hotline to make sure that we knew that someone had slashed her tires, even though she thought there was nothing to be done for her. It cheered me when people thanked me for following up with them on their vote. And although I will never see him again, or I never see him at all, I will always remember the 75-year-old man who told me with pride that he had made his 4 grown sons and their wives send him pictures of themselves dropping their vote by mail ballots in the drop boxes. Around 7:45 at night, when it became apparent that Trump's lead in Florida was too big to be able to bridge with ballot cure, the hotline shift captains received word from the campaign that most of us could sign out. The next morning, one of the members of our active citizens engagement group sent me an email asking me to notify everyone that ballot cure groups were needed in Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. I also immediately emailed the hotline coordinator in Florida and asked if we could redirect our hotline and ballot cure workers to Georgia and tell anyone who lived in North Florida that Georgia needed on-the-ground help. By the afternoon of November 4th, Georgia ballot cure leaders had more than 250 volunteers on every shift, and each shift cured at least a dozen ballots. Every moment is an opportunity for transformation. This sounds very idealistic, but transformation goes all the way up to the national and world levels, and all the way down to individual, physical, emotional, and spiritual levels. And they all interact constantly. In Georgia, we cured 20,000 vote by mail and provisional ballots, and Biden won that state by less than 12,000 votes. Although Biden didn't win Florida, the hotline helped almost 400,000 voters get their ballots cured and counted. And if those 400,000 voters felt less confused or alone because we were able to work with them, they were more likely to vote again and tell their friends about their experience.
So where do we go from here? We can start with the practical. First, we need to keep learning from our successes, from our mistakes, and from the unexpected challenges we face. We must continually reassess the effectiveness of our methods and messages because we live in a constantly evolving world with a huge array of interacting actors.
The Georgia Democrats did an astonishing job of responding to problems that had driven me crazy in the general election just 6 weeks later in the runoff. By late December, they had developed a database to track the number of people who had requested vote by mail ballots that had not been returned. And we were proactively calling voters who needed ballot cure help in the general election. Metrics are also invaluable for evaluating effectiveness and tailoring where to put resources. And volunteers love to hear about metrics. I'm not much of a number cruncher, but here's a chart showing all of the places our 40 active citizen engagement group members were working during the general election. Second, we need a mental paradigm shift so that the American public views the act of voting as beginning with a plan or registration and ending with the verification that their vote has been counted. This will take public education. But if people understand that they have to make sure that their ballot is counted as a matter of course, this could reduce the burden on ballot cure and the number of annoying phone calls that people receive. Also, by making the entire voting process very transparent, many people might come to see that what has been tolerated or justified as supposedly necessary to prevent fraud is actually unnecessary and therefore intolerable.
Third, Democrats and progressives need to think deeply about their messaging. Political messages change, but people's underlying psychological needs and the elements of the stories that we tell through messages are relatively stable. Democrats need to identify shortcomings and formulate principles that can guide solutions. Instead of rejecting and ignoring Republican messaging as ridiculous scare tactics to avoid entirely, Nancer's work has shown us that emotional appeal and factual information go best together. Democrats can also expand and amplify their messaging by offering teach-ins for social media messaging for volunteers, ally groups, and Democratic voters. For many young people, many of whom are rising or first-time voters, and all of whom have the potential to be engaged active citizens and residents, social media became a source of news, urgency, and inspiration throughout the many challenges of 2020. However, for many, it also became overwhelming and draining. Moving forward, I think we can harness the positive aspects of the changing role of some social media outlets. Using effective messaging on these platforms will require clear examples, the ability to track efforts and outcomes, and youth involvement.
My fourth suggestion is aimed at strengthening relationships between volunteers and voters and among volunteers across states. I believe that initiatives should be structured to allow for multiple contacts with potential voters. Volunteers who send postcards can be enabled to follow up with the same voters with additional postcards, texts, or phone calls, and help those on their list confirm that their vote by mail ballots have been counted, or refer them to local hotlines. I also believe that out-of-state activist groups need to form long-term partnerships with swing state groups. The handout that we have talked about previously contains many other practical suggestions.
We also have some conclusions on underlying principles that are needed to sustain social movements in a large, diverse, inclusive country or world.
First, elections and other forms of social change depend on the power of ordinary volunteers. This doesn't mean that we don't value thought leaders and inspirational people such as Stacey Abrams and the Obamas, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Nancy Pelosi, Anthony Fauci, and so many other easily recognizable names. But they would not be able to get anywhere without millions of ordinary people. I believe Joe Biden and Kamala Harris genuinely understand this, but it's up to all of us to remember and enact it.
Second, social change doesn't arise out of nowhere. Rosa Parks didn't just decide one day that she was tired and didn't want to go to the back of the bus. She was already an NAACP chapter secretary and a committed activist when she got on the bus that day. And 9 months earlier, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin had also been arrested for refusing to give up her seat. We are always picking up from where someone else left off. Recognizing this means affirming the importance of actions and the interactions of hundreds of people who we will never meet nor hear about in news articles or history textbooks.
Third, nothing is ever going to be simple or efficient for very long. Our elections, like life, are as complex as chaos theory or synchrony. Progress will be slower than we would like. In solving some problems, we are going to create new ones. But it is still important that we all respond to difficulties and injustice, inequities and inequality wherever we see them.
Fourth, once a hurdle has been achieved, such as the defeat of Donald Trump in the 2020 election, the movement is not one and done in the sense that we can go back to our so-called normal lives. The many people who did not want to give up their privilege before the momentary victory are still there, and they likely have not changed their minds. If the overwhelming majority of people had progressive beliefs about healthcare, policing, Black Lives Matter issues, LGBTQ issues, women's equal pay, climate change, and much more, then there wouldn't need to be a social change movement. The change would just happen. What creates the struggle is that either the number or power of each side is close to the same. Likewise, just because one side wins doesn't mean that everything changes in their favor at once. And similarly, just because we suffer a loss doesn't mean that we have lost forever. Social movements are never over, and our efforts cannot be measured by whether they achieve permanent success.
The promise of ultimate success has actually been the hardest aspect of the hero's journey for me to give up. I often feel like I can't rest until a job is done. So if I or we can't achieve a permanent success, I have felt like I could never rest. Of course, intellectually, I realize that permanent paradise or any other static situation would be pretty boring and would not keep me happy.
One of the deep themes in the heroine's journey is to value wholeness above permanent success. There is no such thing as permanent success. Wholeness includes all the wonder and joy and beauty of life, and it also includes all of the frustration and pain and messiness in equal measure. It is infinitely easier to claim that we believe this than to actually live with it. But valuing wholeness means that you keep moving forward through the struggles that you face, instead of trying to avoid them. Or it means that once you are past them, you don't just tell yourself that you're better now and will never encounter these struggles again. Struggling and or experiencing pain does not mean that you have failed, and it certainly is not the end.
Part of what's helped me to value wholeness is watching so many other people say that they value wholeness but then want to carve off the painful parts of life. When I began to see this as a rather entitled view of the world, it helped me broaden my own perspective. But people still ask, if no success is permanent, what will keep us going? First, I tell them, well, this is the way virtually all of life works. Happily ever after is a myth. Second, I think what keeps us going isn't really the promise of ultimate success, but rather the relationships and community we form in pursuing our common goals together. As John Lewis and so many others have said, we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. And regardless of outcome, those who come after us will benefit from our efforts. Outcomes are not guaranteed, but everything counts. Everything is connected to everything else. This is what makes life and living so interesting. There are a million different voter stories, and there are a jillion different stories about oppression and injustice, and at least as many stories of triumph of the human spirit, kindness, and love. Each time we interact with someone in a genuine way, it's a chance to honor empathy and respect vulnerability. We are never going to permanently achieve all our social justice goals, and new achievements will bring new problems. But each time we take a step, it's an opportunity to experience the humanness and uniqueness of another and of the human spirit. And that's probably what makes life worth living.
We will never achieve permanent success, but we do still need to commemorate our endeavors, challenges, and successes. Recognizing our challenges and innovations with an understanding that they are not the end of the story or the movement helps us to sustain our courage and our commitment to change. An important part of sustainable social change is that people need to be continually taking action.
I think we need a mental paradigm shift on our relationship with civic participation. It can't be something that we gear up for 6 months before an election and then let lie fallow for the next 18 months. You and I have joked about why people expect civic engagement to be an occasional call to arms. What can it be like putting on your clothes or brushing your teeth? We don't get up in the morning and say, geez, I put on clothes yesterday. Don't tell me I have to do it again today. Perhaps what we need is 15-minute clubs in which people commit to the equivalent of 15 minutes a day or an hour and a half a week.
People could join together and share what they do with their weekly hour and a half, so that the intention doesn't just get lost under the weight of daily routines. Being part of a community provides support, motivation, and accountability. So our 15 minutes a day becomes something for which we are accountable to a friendly group, until it becomes a habit, something that we will notice with slight alarm if we don't do, like going out of the house without combing our hair or brushing our teeth.
At first, 15 minutes won't amount to very much, and we won't even be able to come up with 15 minutes every single day or an hour and a half every single week. But over the course of the year, if you had 500 or 1,000 groups of 10 to 20 people doing it, we could rack up a lot of social action. And then if those first groups shared their experiences, and we could double the number of groups the next year, and then again the year after that, think of what we could do. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you all so much.